The word hit her like a branding iron pressed against bare skin. "Failed," Abraham Dawson said, his voice low and stripped of every pretense he had ever worn in her presence. He was standing in the doorway of her small house on the edge of Redemption, Colorado, his hat in his hands, his knuckles white around the brim, and his dark eyes carrying something so raw and unguarded that Violet Barrett felt the breath leave her body as though the high-altitude air had simply decided she did not deserve it anymore. "I tried to stop thinking about you," he said, "and I failed every single morning." Violet had not invited him in. She had not even fully opened the door, because she knew, she had always known, that if she opened the door all the way, something inside her would open too, and she was not sure she could survive what came out of it. Her hand was still on the door frame, her knuckles pressing into the rough-hewn wood as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had become entirely liquid. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "I know it," Abraham said. He did not move, he did not retreat. He stood there in the early morning light of that October day in 1878, with the Colorado mountains behind him and the first real frost of the season turning the air silver, and he looked at her the way a man looks when he has run out of strategies and defenses and clever words, and has nothing left to offer but the unvarnished, terrifying truth. "I know every reason I should not be here. I built that list myself, stone by stone, like a wall I thought would hold." It did not hold Violet. She had not heard her name in his voice for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of deliberate silence, of his wagon passing the edge of her property without slowing, of his shadow crossing her window at the general store and vanishing before she could turn around. 6 weeks that she had spent convincing herself that whatever had happened between them at the harvest supper had been a momentary weakness in both of them, born of lantern light and fiddle music, and the kind of loneliness that accumulates in a person like sediment at the bottom of a still river. 6 weeks of her own failure, if she was being honest. 6 weeks of waking up and reaching for something that was not there. She opened the door all the way. The story of how Violet Barrett came to be standing in the doorway of a small house in Redemption, Colorado, with her heart making terrible choices, began 2 years earlier and 1,000 miles east, in a city where everything was loud and nothing was hers. She had come from St. Louis in the spring of 1876, on a train that smelled of coal smoke and other people's anxiety, carrying one trunk, $17 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, and a letter of employment from a woman named Mrs. Clara Holt, who ran the schoolhouse in Redemption, and needed a teaching assistant capable of managing the older children who had grown too large and too willful for one woman alone to educate. Violet was 24 years old. She had spent the previous 3 years working as a clerk in her uncle's dry goods store after her parents had died of typhoid within a week of each other, leaving her with grief so enormous it had no edges, and with the particular kind of freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. She had answered the advertisement because Redemption sounded like a promise, and because St. Louis felt like a city-shaped coffin, and because she had looked at the life ahead of her in that familiar place and found that it looked exactly like the life behind her, except emptier. What she had not expected, what no advertisement and no letter from Mrs. Holt had prepared her for, was the land itself. She had stepped off the train at the small station in Redemption on a May afternoon and found herself standing in the open throat of the world, with mountains to the west so enormous they seemed to be holding up the sky, and a valley below them that was green and gold and absolutely indifferent to whether she lived or died in it. The indifference, she discovered, was a form of honesty she had been starving for. She had also not expected Abraham Dawson. She did not meet him immediately. The first weeks in Redemption were dense with new information, new faces, new rhythms. Mrs. Holt was a compact, energetic woman of 50 who ran the schoolhouse with the focused intensity of someone who understood that education in a frontier town was not a luxury, but a form of survival. The children were suspicious of Violet at first, sizing her up with the frank assessment that frontier-raised children apply to everything unfamiliar, and then gradually accepting her as they accepted most things. By testing her thoroughly and finding that she held, she learned the geography of the town. The general store run by a stout, bearded man named Elias Pfeiffer. The saloon, which she entered exactly once to speak to the owner about a child whose father spent too much time there and not enough time at home, and which she exited with a new respect for the kind of courage required to manage such a place with any dignity. The church, presided over by a kind and perpetually exhausted minister named Reverend Crane. The telegraph office, the small but surprisingly well-stocked apothecary. The land office, where men arrived daily with desperate hope and left with either a dream or a deed, sometimes both at once. And the ranches that ringed the valley like a necklace of industry and ambition, spreading out toward the mountains and the grasslands with their cattle and their horses and their stubborn, complicated inhabitants. She heard Abraham Dawson's name before she met him. In a small town, names precede people the way thunder precedes lightning. She heard it from Mrs. Holt, who mentioned that the Dawson Ranch contributed generously to the schoolhouse fund every year, and that Abraham Dawson himself had once spent an afternoon repairing the roof when a spring storm tore half of it away, working alongside the other men without speaking much but accomplishing twice what anyone else managed. She heard it from Elias Pfeiffer at the general store, who described Abraham as the kind of man who paid his debts and his bills on time and never cheated anyone, qualities that Elias clearly considered the highest possible virtues. She heard it with a different tone entirely from the women who gathered at the church social that first summer, where the conversation that surrounded Abraham Dawson was threaded with something complicated, admiration and sympathy, and a particular form of careful, respectful distance. He lost his wife. A woman named Dorothea Marsh told her quietly, with the air of someone conveying information that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. 3 years ago, Eleanor, she was good woman and a hard loss. Violet had murmured her sympathies and changed the subject, because grief was something she understood from the inside, and she knew better than to treat another person's loss as an item of interest. She met him in July at the Pfeiffer General Store, in the particular uneventful way that consequential meetings often disguise themselves. She was reaching for a bolt of blue calico on the high shelf, and discovering that she was several inches shorter than the necessary height, and he came in through the door behind her, crossed the room in a few long strides, and simply reached past her and brought it down. She turned around and looked up and found a man somewhere in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and serious-faced, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes the color of the mountains in the late afternoon, that particular shade between brown and something deeper that has no clean name in any language. He was looking at her with a kind of careful attention that was not intrusive, but was absolutely present, as though she had his full focus in the way that a man who is used to reading weather and animals and land has learned to give his full focus to things that matter. "Abraham Dawson," he said, and held out the bolt of calico rather than extending his hand, which she appreciated because her hands were full of a pencil and her shopping list. "Violet Barrett," she said. "The new school teacher." "Assistant," he said. "For now," she said. Something moved across his face at that. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, the possibility of one, seen and then put away with the rest of things that were not quite ready to be used. He nodded, set the calico on the counter for her, bought his own supplies without further conversation, and left. She thought about him on the walk back to the small house Mrs. Holt had arranged for her at the edge of town. She thought about the particular quality of his attention. She thought about the way he had reached past her without any drama or performance of helpfulness, simply solving the problem because it was there to be solved. She thought about those dark, layered eyes and the grief that lived in them like furniture in a room that someone had cleared of everything else. Then she put him in the category of things that were not her concern and went about her life. but Redemption was a small town. Over the following months, she encountered Abraham Dawson with the casual regularity that proximity enforces on people who would otherwise keep a more considered distance. He was at the church socials, sitting on the outer edge of things with the particular stillness of a man who attends, because it is correct and expected rather than because he derives pleasure from it. He was at the town meetings, where land disputes and water rights and the perennial question of whether to extend the road to the northern valley were debated with the passion that frontier people bring to the business of survival. He was in the general store, at the grain exchange, on the road between his ranch and town, passing her on horseback with a nod that was correct and contained, and said nothing at all. She watched him with the schoolteacher part of her brain, the part that had learned to read people quickly and accurately, and what she read in him was a man who had sealed something off. Not a cold man, not an indifferent one, a warm man who had decided, for reasons she could not fully see yet, that warmth was no longer something he could afford to dispense freely. The first real conversation happened in September of 1876, during a sudden afternoon rainstorm that caught them both at the edge of the road between town and her house. She had a folder of student work that she could not let get wet, and she was holding it under her coat and walking fast, and he was coming the opposite direction on foot, having left his horse at the livery for a loose shoe to be corrected. They ducked under the same overhang of the old freight building simultaneously, which required negotiating their positions with the kind of physical awkwardness that breaks down formality faster than almost anything else. "The clouds came up fast," she said, which was an observation requiring no particular courage. "They always do here," he said. "You learn to read the morning sky early when you live in the valley. By the time you can smell rain, you are already too late. What do you look for?" he told her. He described the way the light changed on the western peaks when pressure was building, the particular behavior of the cattle when a front was moving in, the color that the clouds turned in the hour before they committed to a storm. He talked about it without any performance, without the self-conscious awareness that he was telling her something, in the way that people talk when they forget for a moment to be careful and simply speak from where they actually live. She listened with her whole attention, and somewhere in the middle of his description of the way the wind moves through the grass before rain, she realized that she was not just absorbing information but watching his face, which had changed. The sealed quality was still there, but something under it had shifted, the way ice shifts in a thaw, not broken but altered, full of invisible motion. When the rain stopped, they separated without ceremony, and she walked home with the folder still dry under her coat and something new and inconvenient alive in her chest. She did not speak to him again for 3 weeks. When she did, it was at the harvest supper of 1876, where the whole town gathered in the church hall to celebrate the end of the season with food and music, and the particular warmth that people who have survived another hard year together manage to generate. She was helping serve pie when he appeared across the table from her, and she handed him a slice and he thanked her, and then, instead of moving on, he stayed. "You've been here 6 months, he said. "Nearly 7, she said. "How does it suit you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Better than anything has suited me in a long time," she said honestly. He looked at her steadily. "Where were you before?" "St. Louis, but I am not from St. Louis. I am from Ohio, originally. A town called Carlisle. My parents died and I went to work for my uncle, and then I saw the advertisement for Mrs. Holt's position and decided that distance was the only thing that made any sense." She had not intended to say all of that. She had learned in the months since her parents' deaths to give shorter, more contained answers to that particular question, because people tended to look at her with an expression of mournful sympathy that she found exhausting and slightly dishonest, because they did not actually know what to do with her grief, and the expression was as much about their own discomfort as her loss. But she said all of it to Abraham Dawson, and he did not look at her with sympathy. He looked at her with recognition. "Distance makes a different kind of sense," he said, "until it doesn't." She thought she understood what he meant. She was not sure he intended her to understand quite so much of it, because he picked up his pie and moved away, and for the rest of that evening she was more aware of where he was in the room than she had been of anything since arriving in Redemption. That was 1876. The autumn and winter that followed were full of small accumulated moments that she catalogued privately and refused to examine too directly. The way he stopped his wagon one February morning, when she was struggling to carry firewood from the stack to her house through knee-deep snow, and loaded it all in one trip with the same unstated practicality with which he had lifted the calico bolt from the high shelf. The evening in March of 1877, when a student of hers, a boy of 11 named Tobias Reeves, went missing during a cold snap, and the whole town turned out to search, and Abraham led the effort with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with rank or officiousness and everything to do with competence. And they found Tobias 2 hours later in a drainage culvert, cold and frightened but unhurt. And when the boy was back in his parents' arms, Abraham stood at the edge of the gathering and caught Violet's eye across the crowd, with an expression that said everything about relief, without saying any of it aloud. The spring dance of 1877, where he danced with her exactly once, in a perfectly correct and entirely shattering way, his hand at the small of her back, with the careful, deliberate lightness of a man who was acutely conscious of what he was touching and what it cost him to be so careful. She began to understand his dark past in pieces, the way you understand something large by gathering its fragments. Abraham Dawson had died in the winter of 1873, of a fever that took her in 4 days, leaving Abraham with a ranch to run and a grief so acute that several people in Redemption had not been sure, that first terrible winter, that he would come through it. He had come through it, because he was the kind of man who could survive almost anything through sheer internal stubbornness. But he had emerged from it with the sealed quality she had first noticed, and he had been sealed ever since. There had been women in Redemption and the surrounding county who had understood this, and had done their best to offer themselves as the solution to it, because Abraham Dawson was a respected man with a good ranch and a character that everyone acknowledged, and those were not small things in 1877 Colorado. He had been invariably courteous and equally invariably unreachable. Until, apparently, he was not. The thing that broke it open was not a grand gesture or a dramatic crisis, but a Thursday afternoon in early September of 1877, when Violet was sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, reading a letter from her aunt in Ohio, and Abraham rode up on his big gray horse to drop off the quarterly contribution to Mrs. Holt and found her there, clearly upset. With the letter in her hand and her eyes bright in the particular way that precedes tears one is refusing to shed, he dismounted and tied the horse and sat down on the step beside her without asking, which she found she did not mind at all. "Bad news?" he asked. "My aunt writes that the house I grew up in has been sold," she said. "I knew it would be. There was no reason to keep it, but I had not expected to feel quite so." She stopped. "Unmoored," he said. She looked at him. "Yes, exactly that. Something about a place," he said quietly. "Even a place you have left, it is like a point on a map. When it goes, you have to redraw the map." She felt the tears she had been managing recede, not because the grief was smaller, but because someone was holding it with her in the way that made it bearable. "Have you had to redraw yours?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light was the thick golden kind that September produces, laying itself over everything like honey. "More than once," he said. They sat there until the light began to shift and the evening coolness came down from the mountains, and they talked, really talked, for the first time. He told her about the ranch, about the particular satisfactions and the particular brutalities of raising cattle in a high valley, where weather and market prices and the stubbornness of animals conspired against you on a regular basis. He told her about growing up on his father's place in Kansas, the younger of two sons, watching the land work its way into a person's bones until they became something like the land themselves. He told her about coming to Colorado at 25 with Alina and two other families, all of them chasing the same impossible beautiful dream of land that was theirs, and how the dream had been real and the land had been real, and Alina had been the most real thing in it, and then she had not been there anymore. He said it plainly, without performance, with the kind of directness that frightened her a little, because it required her to receive it with equal directness. And so she told him about her parents, about the week they had died, about the specific particular silence of a house that contains grief that has not yet resolved into its final form, about the way she had worked in her uncle's store for 3 years feeling like a woman made of obligation, rather than anything that was genuinely hers. When he rode away that evening, something had changed between them. She knew it and she suspected he knew it, and what happened in the months that followed was the slow, careful, terrifying negotiation between two people who have both been hurt by the world, and are therefore in the position of knowing exactly what they have to lose and exactly how much it would cost them to lose it again. The harvest supper of 1877 was where everything crystallized. She had been aware of him all evening with the heightened, exhausting awareness that she had by then simply accepted as the condition of being near Abraham Dawson. They had been seated near each other at the long table and had talked with the ease that had developed between them over the year, interrupted by other conversations, the natural flow of a community gathering, but always returning to each other the way water returns to its level. After the meal, when the tables were pushed back and the fiddles came out, he stood before her and extended his hand and she put hers in it, and they danced. Not the careful, deliberate once of the spring before, but twice, 3 times, and at some point during the third dance she realized that the careful light weight of his hand at her back had changed, that he was holding her with something that was no longer performing casualness, but was simply holding her, and she had leaned into it by exactly the fraction of an inch that turns dancing into a declaration. When the music stopped, they were standing closer together than they had any practical reason to be, and he was looking at her with those dark layered eyes with all the ceiling stripped away, and she could see everything in him, the longing and the fear and the forbidden hope and the terrible, tender vulnerability of a man who has decided, without yet saying so, that he is willing to risk being destroyed again. "Violet," he said, and that was all he said, just her name, but in his voice it contained a question she was not quite ready to answer in a room full of people, and she stepped back because she was afraid, because the feeling in her chest was so enormous she did not trust herself to manage it correctly, and the stepping back was a mistake she spent the following weeks regretting. He misread it. That was what she understood later. He had been standing at the absolute edge of his courage, and she had stepped back, and he had interpreted it as a refusal. And because he was Abraham Dawson, who had sealed himself off for 4 years and had only recently allowed the seal to loosen, he had sealed himself off again with the efficiency of a man who has a great deal of practice in that particular art. The 6 weeks that followed were the worst 6 weeks she had spent since Ohio. She watched him withdraw with the helpless, frustrated knowledge that she had caused it, and the complicated pride that prevented her from simply saying so, because saying so required her to admit what she was withdrawing from, and she was afraid that if she said it aloud it would become real in a way she could not take back. The hidden motive in her own fear was this: she had come to redemption to be free. She had come here carrying nothing, responsible for no one, belonging to no particular life. She had built something in this valley over 18 months, a purpose in the schoolhouse, a place in the community, a self that was genuinely hers for the first time. The thought of handing any of that over, of becoming the woman who loved Abraham Dawson, and therefore became subject to the extraordinary vulnerability that loving someone creates, terrified her in a way that no practical danger she had faced in her frontier life had managed to do. So she had stepped back, and he had closed, and they had spent 6 weeks in redemption being correct and distant with each other, while the town watched with the unsubtle attention of a community that notices everything and keeps its own counsel exactly as long as it takes for the next piece of evidence to emerge. And then, on a morning in late October of 1877, there was a crisis that cracked everything open. The crisis arrived in the form of Jerome Hollis. Jerome Hollis was a land speculator from Denver who had arrived in Redemption 3 weeks earlier with a leather satchel full of documents and a manner that managed to be simultaneously ingratiating and predatory, the combination that successful swindlers perfect. And he had been making the rounds of the valley's landowners with an offer to buy acreage at prices that sounded generous until you read the contract language, which contained a hidden clause that would allow Hollis to repurchase the mineral rights to the sold land at a fixed low price within 5 years. Violet had learned about this through one of her older students, whose father was a small farmer named Thomas Reed, who had nearly signed the contract before his wife had read the small print and raised the alarm. The trap was this. Several families in the valley were in a difficult enough financial position after a dry summer that Hollis's initial prices were genuinely tempting, and without someone to stand in the way and make the deception clear, several people were likely to sign themselves into a form of legal servitude regarding any minerals or coal deposits that might be found on their land. Violet had discovered this on a Wednesday morning and had spent the day in a fury of quiet, focused action. She had gone to the land office and asked to read the actual statute regarding mineral rights in Colorado, which was public record, and had copied down the relevant language. She had gone to each of the families she knew to be in discussions with Hollis and explained clearly and without drama what the contract actually meant. She had written a letter to the county seat requesting that someone with legal authority review Hollis's documentation. What she had not accounted for was that Hollis, discovering his scheme unraveling faster than he had anticipated, would decide that the most efficient solution was to remove the person doing the unraveling. He came to her house on the Wednesday evening with 2 men she did not recognize, and a manner that had entirely abandoned the ingratiating portion of its usual presentation. He told her, standing on her porch in the dark, that she had been interfering in private business arrangements, and that it would be in her interest to keep her attention focused on her schoolchildren. The 2 men behind him said nothing, but managed nonetheless to convey a comprehensive threat. Violet told him that what was in her interest and what she chose to do were different matters, and that she had a document she had already dispatched by the evening rider to the county seat that would be in the hands of the appropriate authority by morning. This was not entirely true. The letter existed. She had not yet given it to anyone. Hollis left. She bolted the door and sat down on her kitchen floor with her heart hammering at a rate that suggested it had significant concerns about the judgment she had just demonstrated, and she thought about what to do. She thought about Abraham Dawson, not because she was afraid and wanted protection, or not only for that reason. She thought about him because he was the person in this town whose judgment she trusted most completely, whose knowledge of the law and the land and the people was deep and reliable, and because, if she was honest, she had been thinking about him every morning for 6 weeks and was exhausted by the pretense that she was not. She wrote a note and sent it with her neighbor's boy, who was 12 and reliable and lived 4 houses down, and she waited. He came within the hour. He came in through the front door, which she had opened, and he stood in her small front room taking in the details of the situation with the focused attention she had come to associate with him, and she told him everything quickly and clearly, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the letter?" he asked. "Here." She gave it to him. He read it. "This is well written," he said. "It is accurate and it will work." The question is getting it to the county seat tonight instead of waiting for the morning rider, because Hollies will use the time. Can you ride it? I can ride it, he said, without any drama. But I want to speak to Thomas Reed first, and to Elias Pfeiffer, and to 2 or 3 of the other men who were in discussions with Hollies. If Hollies decides to try something before morning, you should not be alone here. He organized it with quiet efficiency. Within 2 hours, the letter was on its way to the county seat in the hands of a rancher named Carl Webb, who was headed there anyway and was glad to ride faster. The families who had been approached by Hollies were gathered at the Pfeiffer store with a clear understanding of their legal position, and 2 of the Valley men had volunteered to keep watch near Hollies' lodgings at the boarding house to ensure that he did not take any precipitous action before morning. Abraham himself had not ridden to the county seat. He had stayed. He stayed in her house, in her front room, in the chair near the window with his rifle resting across his knees in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than dramatic, and Violet sat across from him and they talked, and the 6 weeks of distance dissolved like the morning frost when the sun comes over the mountains. They talked until the sky began to lighten. About Hollies and the broader problem of speculators who preyed on frontier communities. About the land itself and what it meant to the people who worked it. About the school and the children and the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something they had not understood before. About Alina, whom he spoke of now without the careful containment he had always employed, not because the grief was gone but because he had decided to trust her with it. About Ohio and St. Louis and the particular texture of loss and distance and the strange grace of reinvention. When the dawn came through the window and the sounds of redemption waking reached them, they were both tired and entirely alive, and he was looking at her in the steady, open way that had no seal on it anymore, and she was looking back at him with the same unguarded directness. "I stepped back," she said, "at the harvest supper. I stepped back and I did not mean what you thought I meant." He was quiet. "I was afraid," she said. "I am still afraid, but I have been more afraid for 6 weeks of the alternative." He set the rifle against the wall carefully and crossed the room and stood before her, and he took her hands in both of his, and she felt the particular warmth and roughness of his hands the way you feel something you have been trying not to want. "What is the alternative?" he asked quietly. "Not having this," she said. "Not having whatever this is." He raised her hands and held them against his chest, just below his collarbone, where she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, steady and rapid all at once. "I need you to know," he said, "that I understand what I am asking. I am not asking you to stop being who you are. I am not asking you to give up the school or the independence or the way you walked into Hollies' situation last night without any hesitation. I am not asking for any of that to change." "Then what are you asking?" she said, though she knew she wanted to hear it. "I am asking for the chance to be the person who is there when you need someone," he said. "And the person you come back to, that is all, that is everything." That morning, Jerome Hollies and his 2 associates were met at the edge of town by the county marshal, who had ridden through the night after receiving an urgent telegraph message that Abraham had arranged before Violet had even sent her note, because he had apparently been monitoring the Hollies situation himself after hearing about it from Thomas Reed's wife at the general store, and had had the presence of mind to take action, even while he was still maintaining the fiction of distance from Violet Barrett. Hollies was escorted out of Redemption County, with a clarity about the legal consequences of returning that left no room for misinterpretation. And in the kitchen of the small house on the edge of Redemption, Abraham Dawson made coffee on Violet's stove, and they sat together as the October morning opened around them, and neither of them pretended any more. What followed was a courtship that the town of Redemption watched with the warm, invested attention that a community brings to the love stories it has been rooting for quietly for months. It was not always smooth. They were 2 people who had both learned to be sufficient unto themselves, and the process of learning to make room for another person's presence and preferences and rhythms was real work, attended by real friction. He had a stubbornness that showed itself in his conviction that physical tasks were his responsibility, and that accepting help with them was an act that required more renegotiation than he had initially budgeted for. She had a fierceness that showed itself in the way she made decisions at speed without always informing him, because she had been deciding alone for so long that including another person in the process required deliberate, conscious effort. These were not fundamental incompatibilities, but they were genuine adjustments, and the adjustments required honesty and occasional discomfort, and the willingness to say, more than once in both directions, that they had gotten something wrong. What made it work, what she understood as the winter of 1877 deepened around them, was that Abraham Dawson was the specific kind of man who thought that honesty was more important than comfort. He would rather know the true shape of a thing, even when the shape was difficult, than live in the easier version of it. This was not a quality she had expected to find so beautiful, but she found it the most beautiful thing about him, more than his steadiness or his competence or the way his face changed when he was genuinely amused, which was rarer than laughter but more real. He proposed to her in March of 1878 in the kitchen of the farmhouse on the Dawson Ranch, which she had come to love with the particular love of someone who encounters a place that feels like it has been waiting for them. He did not make a ceremony of it, because ceremony was not his register. He was washing up after supper and she was reading at the kitchen table, and he turned around and said, "I think we should get married. I think you know that I love you and I believe you love me, and I want us to stop living in two separate houses and begin living in one." She set down her book. "You think we should," she said. "I know we should," he said, correcting himself. "And I want to. I want to more than I have wanted anything since Alina, and before you tell me that is complicated, I know it is. I know I am asking you to live in the house that was hers and to be my wife in a place where she was my wife. I know it asks something of you that is not fair to ask, but Violet, I would build you a new house on the far end of the ranch if that is what you need. I would do whatever is required. I just want you." She looked at him standing there by the wash basin with his sleeves rolled up and his dark eyes carrying all of it, all the love and the hope and the old grief and the new hope that was stronger than the grief now, and she said, "I don't need a new house. I need you in it." They were married in June of 1878 in the Redemption Church on a Saturday morning when the valley was at its most extravagant, all green and gold with the summer coming up from the earth. Mrs. Holt cried, which she denied afterward. Elias Pfeiffer brought a ham to the reception. Reverend Crane performed the ceremony with the focused joy of a man who had been hoping for it since October of the previous year. Thomas Reed and his wife came. Carl Webb came. The children from the school made a banner that said "Miss Barrett, Mrs. Dawson, same person," in large, earnest letters which she kept. She took the position of lead teacher that fall when Mrs. Holt retired to her sister's home in Denver, and she ran the schoolhouse with the same focused intensity that her predecessor had, except that she also had a ranch to come home to and a husband who always had coffee waiting when she got there. And the combination of those two things produced in her a happiness so complete and ordinary and extraordinary all at once that she sometimes stood in the middle of it and felt a profound, wordless gratitude for the advertisement she had answered in a St. Louis newspaper 2 years before. The first years of their marriage were full. She ran the school. He ran the ranch with the addition of 2 new hands he hired in the summer of 1878, young men of 20 and 22, named Pete Garza and Samuel Trout, who were competent workers and tolerable company, and who treated Violet with a respectful ease that she appreciated. The cattle operation expanded. Abraham had a talent for the business side of ranching that surprised people who saw only the quiet, physical man and did not notice the mind behind it. And by 1880, the Dawson operation was one of the 3 most successful in the county. They argued about money once seriously, when he proposed spending a significant amount on a new bull for the herd, and she thought the schoolhouse needed the community investment more than the ranch did. And the argument lasted 3 days and resolved itself in the thoroughly adult way that arguments between two people who respect each other generally resolve, with both of them being partially right and the solution incorporating both of their concerns, and with a subsequent conversation about how they made decisions jointly that was uncomfortable and necessary, and made everything better afterward. She had secrets she had not fully shared, and he had some too, and the process of the marriage was partly the process of choosing to share them. She told him about the man in St. Louis, a merchant's son named William Carver who had courted her in the year after her parents died, and whom she had very nearly agreed to marry out of grief and exhaustion and the particular vulnerability of loss, and who had turned out to have the hidden motive of access to her uncle's store accounts, which she had discovered in time, and from which she had extricated herself with dignity, but with a new and lasting suspicion of her own judgment in emotional matters. This suspicion, she told Abraham, was part of what had caused her to step back at the harvest supper. He told her about the winter after Eleanor died, the specific darkness of it, the period of several months when he had done nothing more than the minimum required to keep the ranch and himself alive, and had seen no further into the future than the next day. He told her about the specific morning in February of 1874, when he had ridden out to the northern pasture in the snow and the absolute silence of it, and sat on his horse for what felt like hours and made the decision, not dramatically but simply, to stay. He had never told anyone else about that morning, and the trust he was extending by telling her was something she received with both hands. Their son was born in April of 1880. They named him James, for Abraham's father, and he arrived in the world with a quantity of dark hair and a set of opinions about his circumstances that he expressed loudly and at length from the first moment. The birth was attended by Dorothea Marsh, who had some medical training and served as Redemption's closest approximation to a midwife, and by Mrs. Holt, who drove up from Denver specifically for the occasion, and spent the waiting hours explaining to Abraham at great length how he ought to be feeling about impending fatherhood, advice he received with patient good humor. Violet had not known she could love anything the way she loved James Dawson. It was a different love from the one she had for Abraham, not competing with it but running alongside it at a different frequency, filling a part of her that she had not known was empty. She kept teaching, 3 days a week initially, then back to full-time by the fall when Dorothea Marsh, who had 4 children of her own and a generous disposition, offered to look after James on school days. Abraham took the mornings with his son before the ranch work required his full attention, and those mornings, she knew from the way he came to the kitchen afterward with a particular quiet contentment about him, were important in a way that went beyond practicality. The second crisis came in the summer of 1881, and it came from a direction they had not anticipated. Abraham's older brother, a man named Curtis Dawson, arrived in Redemption from Kansas in July with 3 weeks of luggage and a manner that suggested he intended to stay considerably longer. Curtis was 40 years old to Abraham's 33, and where Abraham was quiet and deliberate, Curtis was expansive and fast-talking, and carried about him the air of a man who had been in several situations requiring rapid exit, and had exited them with varying degrees of success. Violet disliked him immediately, and felt guilty about this for approximately 2 days before concluding that her instinct was sound, and the guilt was not useful. Curtis Dawson was not a bad man in the simplest sense, but he had the particular quality of someone who has moved through life, applying a great deal of charm and a great deal of reliance on the goodwill of others, without ever quite doing the work required to generate genuine goodwill in return. He had, as became clear over several weeks, left Kansas under circumstances that involved debts of a financial and personal nature that he was not forthcoming about specifying, and he had come to his younger brother's ranch, with the unspoken expectation that Abraham would absorb both him and his trouble as a matter of family loyalty. Abraham, to his credit and to a degree that frustrated Violet considerably, did not simply accept this uncritically. But he also did not turn his brother away, because whatever Curtis was and whatever he had done, he was Abraham's brother and Abraham's sense of obligation ran deep. The dark past that Curtis was evading caught up with him in August, in the form of a letter from a man in Wichita who was owed money and had engaged a lawyer to collect it. The amount was considerable, not ruinous for the Dawson Ranch but significant, and the manner of its arrival was disruptive to the careful financial planning that Abraham and Violet had done together for the coming year. The argument they had about this was the most serious of their marriage, not because they disagreed about Curtis fundamentally, but because Violet felt that Abraham was managing the situation without including her in the decisions, which was precisely the pattern they had identified and addressed in their first year, and which she had believed was resolved. Abraham, for his part, felt that his family situation was being subjected to a level of scrutiny that was itself a form of criticism, which was not entirely wrong, and which was also not a reason to exclude her. They got through it. They got through it by doing what they had learned to do, by saying the difficult things directly and receiving them with the same directness, by being more interested in understanding each other than in winning the argument. Curtis's debt was paid from ranch funds, with an explicit, legal agreement between the brothers about repayment. Curtis himself remained on the ranch through the autumn, doing work that he was capable of doing when he applied himself, which was more often than Violet had initially expected. By the winter of 1881, she had arrived at a position regarding Curtis Dawson that was not warm but was fair. He was a man who had never quite grown into the full dimension of himself, and he was in a place now where that growing might actually happen, and she was willing to extend him the room to do it while maintaining the careful accounting of the ranch finances that she had, by agreement with Abraham, taken as her primary responsibility after the Curtis situation clarified why it mattered. Curtis stayed through the winter and into the spring of 1882, and then he met a woman named Frances Holbrook who ran the laundry in Redemption, a widow of 35 with 2 adolescent children, and a sharp eye for character that had initially led her to the same rapid dislike of Curtis that Violet had experienced. Something shifted between them over the winter, and by the spring they were spending enough time together that the town had noticed, and by the summer they were planning to move to Denver together, where Curtis intended to work for a freight company that Frances's brother managed. Violet watched this development with genuine surprise and cautious optimism, and said very little except when directly asked. The summer of 1882 brought something else, something she had not expected to feel again so acutely: the death of Dorothea Marsh, from a fast-moving illness that took her in 10 days in the August heat, leaving her husband Cornelius and their 4 children in a state of loss so immediate and total that the whole community organized around them in the instinctive way of people who have all, at various points, been in the same position. Violet went every day for 2 weeks. She helped with the children, with the cooking, with the specific practical tasks that grief makes impossible. She sat with Cornelius in the evenings when the children were in bed, and listened to him talk about Dorothea the way she had once wished someone would listen to her talk about her parents. Coming home to the ranch those evenings, she would find Abraham in the kitchen with the lamp lit and James asleep, and she would sit down and he would pour her coffee and they would sit together in the quiet, and the particular quality of that quiet, the warmth of it, the safety of it, the way it asked nothing of her but her presence, was something she understood now as the central fact of her life. She was pregnant again by the autumn of 1882. The pregnancy was harder than the first, not dangerously but persistently, with a fatigue that did not lift the way it had with James and a nausea that lasted deep into the second trimester, and made her first months of the school year an exercise in willpower that her older students noticed and respected, and her younger students were too absorbed in their own dramas to register. Abraham was extraordinary. This was the word she arrived at, not romantic or idealized but precise. He managed additional domestic responsibilities without any drama of accommodation, simply incorporated them into the daily structure of his life as though they had always been there. He drove her to school on mornings when the fatigue was worst and picked her up in the afternoons. He cooked, which he was not as skilled at as he was at most things, but approached with the same determined practicality he brought to problems on the ranch. He sat behind her in the evenings and worked the tiredness out of her shoulders with his hands and talked to her about the ranch and the cattle and the small daily events of redemption, keeping her connected to the life around them when she was too exhausted to seek connection herself. Their daughter arrived in May of 1883, and they named her Clara, for Mrs. Holt, who cried again in Denver when the letter arrived and came to visit in July, and held the baby for an entire afternoon with an expression of satisfied completion. James was 3 years old and had strong opinions about his sister, initially negative, transitioning to a possessive devotion over the following months that expressed itself in the form of standing guard over her basket, with an importance that was both hilarious and genuinely touching. Life on the Dawson Ranch in the middle years of the 1880s had a quality that Violet returned to often in her thoughts in the later years, trying to identify its essential nature. It was not uneventful. The cattle business had its crises, weather and disease and market fluctuations that required constant adjustment. The school had its difficulties. A particularly challenging year in 1884, when 3 families from different factions of a long-running land dispute sent children who imported the dispute into the classroom, and required every resource of patience and creativity she possessed to manage. The community continued to grow and change, with new families arriving and old ones departing, with the slow, inevitable transformation that progress and time perform on any living place. But under all of it was something stable and warm and reliable, the particular quality of a life that 2 people have built together from honest materials, without pretense, and without the kinds of secrets that corrode. She loved him in the daily, specific, unremarkable way that is the deepest form of love, the way that is made of coffee cups and worries shared, and disagreements resolved and laughter at supper, and the weight of another person's sleeping presence in the same bed, and the look on a face across a room that says, "I know exactly who you are, and I have chosen you with full knowledge of that." The thing she had feared, the thing she had stepped back from at the harvest supper of 1877, because it was so large she could not look at it directly, had turned out to be the thing she could not imagine the shape of her life without. There was a moment in the spring of 1885 that she would return to again and again as the truest single moment of the whole. She was sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the early morning, before the children were up and before the day had imposed its demands, with a cup of coffee and the particular clarity that comes with the first warmth after a long Colorado winter. The mountains were doing something extraordinary with the light, as they often did, turning it into a substance that had weight and texture. Abraham came out and sat beside her without speaking, and they were quiet together for a long time, watching the morning come fully into itself over the valley. "I tried to stop thinking about you," he said eventually, conversationally, as though they were in the middle of a discussion she had not realized they were having. She looked at him. He was watching the mountains, his coffee in his hand, with the small private smile that she had learned over 7 years to read with precision. "When?" she said. "After the harvest supper. After you stepped back." He turned and looked at her directly with those dark layered eyes that had held everything from the beginning, all the depth and the loss and the love. "Every morning I woke up and told myself to stop. Every morning I failed." She felt the warmth of it move through her like sunlight through water. "I am glad you failed," she said. "So am I," he said. He reached across and took her hand, and they sat together in the morning with the mountains and the valley and the life they had built, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing that every morning was made of. James came out 10 minutes later and demanded to know if there was breakfast, and Clara toddled behind him with her hair in chaos and one shoe on and one shoe off, and Abraham stood up and lifted his daughter onto his hip and went inside to start the stove, and Violet followed with both coffee cups, and the morning became what mornings were, full and ordinary and entirely theirs. The later years brought more seasons of the same richly textured daily life, and they brought changes that were sometimes difficult and always navigated together. In 1886, Pete Garza, who had been with the ranch for 8 years, came to Abraham with the news that he had saved enough to put a deposit on a small piece of land to the east and intended to start his own operation, a cattle and horse concern that would be modest but his own. Abraham shook his hand and meant it, and helped him with the practical details of establishing the claim, and Violet made a supper for the occasion that took up the whole kitchen table. Pete Garza's departure was the kind of loss that is also unequivocally a celebration, and they celebrated it as such. Samuel Trout stayed on and became the Dawson Ranch's foreman in 1887, having grown from a 20-year-old with strong arms and limited judgment into a thoughtful 30-year-old with strong arms and significantly better judgment, the improvement having been assisted in no small part by the patient, particular management style of the ranch's owners, who had always treated the people who worked with them as people rather than instruments. James started at the schoolhouse in 1885, in the profound awkwardness of being a student in his mother's school, which he managed with more grace than she had anticipated, partly because she was scrupulous about treating him exactly as she treated every other student, and partly because he had inherited his father's particular quality of taking the world as he found it and working with what was there. By 1888, when he was 8 years old, he had a serious passion for horses that he expressed by spending every available hour in the barn with Samuel Trout learning everything about their care and training, and Abraham watched this with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Violet found profoundly moving. Clara was her own creature entirely, which was exactly right. She was a child who combined her father's steadiness with her mother's fierce directness, in a combination that was both formidable and delightful, and who had developed by the age of 5 a habit of staring at problems with the focused intensity of a person conducting a scientific study before deciding on her approach, a habit that served her considerably better than the impulsive alternatives. She adored her brother with a completeness that occasionally inconvenienced him when he was trying to maintain the dignity appropriate to an 8-year-old, in the presence of a 5-year-old who would follow him absolutely anywhere. The last decade of the century brought larger changes to the valley and the territory. Colorado had been a state since 1876, and by the late 1880s, the transformation that statehood accelerates was fully underway in Redemption and the surrounding county. New roads, a better connection to the rail network at the county seat, a larger general store that had replaced Elias Pfeiffer's original establishment after Elias retired in 1884, and his son Magnus took over and expanded. A second school building, made necessary by the growing population, which Violet managed as superintendent with a second teacher named Hattie Brennan, a young woman from Ohio who reminded her in several ways of her younger self, and whom she mentored with the care of someone who understood exactly what a person from Ohio was doing when they came west. In 1889, she and Abraham made the journey to Denver to visit Mrs. Holt, who was then 70 and in failing health, and who sat with them in her sister's parlor and told them, with the direct warmth that had been her hallmark since Violet had first arrived in Redemption, that watching the two of them together was one of the great satisfactions of her life. She died the following spring, and Violet attended the funeral in Denver and stood at the grave of the woman who had placed an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper in 1876, and in doing so had changed the entire course of her life, and felt a grief that was also deeply mixed with gratitude. In the autumn of 1891, Abraham came to her with an idea that had been building in him, he said, for a year. He wanted to bring water to the northern pasture through an irrigation channel that would require a significant investment of labor and materials, but would substantially increase the carrying capacity of the ranch. The idea was sound. The engineering was feasible. The cost was real. They spread the plans on the kitchen table after the children were in bed and went through them together with the financial ledgers open beside them. And she asked questions, and he answered them. And she asked more questions, and he answered those too. And by the end of the evening, they had made the decision together, and it felt, as their shared decisions had always felt when they got it right, like something that was larger than either of them and belonged to both. The irrigation project took 2 full seasons to complete and became, as these things often do, a community project before it was done, with other ranchers contributing labor in exchange for access to the water. And Violet organized the communal suppers that fed the work crews on the major weekends, cooking for 20 on a regular basis, with a matter-of-factness that would have startled the woman she had been in St. Louis, and seemed perfectly natural to the woman she had become. The channel was completed in the fall of 1893, and the northern pasture in the spring of 1894 was a different country from what it had been, green and rich, and capable of sustaining twice the herd it had previously supported. Abraham stood at the edge of it on a May morning and looked at it, and Violet stood beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the water moving in the channel and the grass coming up on either side of it with the dark, satisfied silence of people who have made something real. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived in November of 1893, which meant that Violet had managed the final stages of the irrigation project's organizational demands while approximately 7 months pregnant, a fact that she considered among the more impressive logistical achievements of her life, and that Abraham told people about with a combination of pride and retrospective alarm that made her laugh every time. Thomas was a different child from both James and Clara, a sunny, sociable creature with his father's dark hair and his mother's violet blue eyes, and a temperament that seemed designed specifically to charm everyone he encountered, which he did with a thoroughness that suggested either a natural gift or a project he had undertaken with systematic intent. By the time he was 2, he had charmed Samuel Trout's wife, the minister's housekeeper, 3 neighboring farm wives, and every child in his siblings' immediate social world. James found this both admirable and exhausting. Clara found it useful. As the decade turned toward the end of the century, Violet found herself reflecting more often on the whole shape of the thing, the life that had assembled itself piece by piece from the unlikely starting materials of grief and distance, and a newspaper advertisement, and a bolt of blue calico on a high shelf. She was 44 years old in 1898. Abraham was 50. He had more gray in his hair than not now, and the years of outdoor work had given his face a weathered quality that she found, if possible, even more compelling than the face she had first looked up at in Elias Pfeiffer's store 22 years before. He was still the man who paid attention, who arrived when needed, who brought honesty to the difficult conversations and patience to the ordinary ones, who could silence a room simply by deciding to speak, and could make her laugh simply by the particular way he looked at her when she was in the middle of being magnificent, and he was aware of it. She was still the woman who decided fast and acted on it, who ran the school with the focused intensity of someone who understood that what she was doing mattered in ways that would outlast her, who loved the valley and the mountains and the particular quality of Colorado light with the deep attachment of someone who has chosen a place and had the place choose her back. She was also, and this was something she had accepted fully and without apology, a woman who loved her husband in a way that was central to who she had become, not because she needed him to be complete, but because the life they had built together was the best version of any life she could have imagined, and she had the imagination for detail. James was 18 years old in 1898, and he had by then declared his intention to take over the horse training and breeding aspect of the Dawson operation, which Samuel Trout had been developing alongside the cattle work since the early 90s. He was a serious, skilled young man with a natural gift for horses that exceeded even his childhood passion, and Abraham had worked with him through his teenage years, with the patience of a man who understood that the best thing you could give a person with a genuine ability was the space and the instruction to develop it fully. Clara was 15, and she was studying with the same intensity that her mother had brought to learning, with a particular interest in mathematics that Violet nurtured with everything she had, and with a correspondence she established with a woman professor at a college in Denver who had agreed to provide Clara with advanced instruction by mail. Clara had said, at 14, with the absolute calm of someone stating an obvious fact, that she intended to attend university. Violet had said that she intended to make sure Clara could. Abraham had nodded and then gone to his study and written a letter to the Denver College asking what would be required for a girl of exceptional ability to be considered for admission in 4 years. Thomas was 6 years old and was applying his social gifts to the task of starting school, which he was approaching as though it were a project he had been planning for some time. One September evening in 1898, after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet around them, Violet was sitting at the kitchen table going over the school accounts, and Abraham was reading across from her, and the lamp was burning between them, and the night sounds of Colorado were coming through the open window, and she put down her pen and looked at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up. The reading expression shifted into the full attention she still found, after all this time, slightly breathtaking in its completeness. "I want to tell you that I know exactly what my life would have been if I had married William Carver or stayed in St. Louis or answered a different advertisement," she said. "I know what the other version of my life looked like, and I want you to know that I am aware every day that I am in the extraordinary version." He was quiet for a moment. "That morning on the porch," he said, "when I told you that I had failed every morning trying not to think of you, do you remember what you said? I said I was glad you failed." "I carry that," he said. "I have carried it for 13 years, the gladness of it." "That you were glad." She reached across the table and took his hand the way she had the first time he had offered her the possibility of everything, and held it. "I will always be glad," she said. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and clear, full of stars so numerous they looked like something accidentally spilled across the dark, and the mountains were shapes against the sky, and the valley was breathing around them in its slow, vast, indifferent way. And inside the kitchen of the Dawson ranch, two people who had both lost everything and found something better looked at each other in the lamplight, with the full knowledge of what they were to each other and were sufficient. The years after 1898 continued to unfold with the particular texture that deep happiness produces. Not the dramatic heights of early love, but the rich, complex, layered satisfaction of a life that is genuinely good, not because it has been free of difficulty, but because the difficulty has been faced together and has made both of them more rather than less. James married in 1901, a girl named Rosalie Vega from one of the ranching families in the Southern Valley, who had grown up working alongside her brothers, and had the same honest competence with animals and land that James himself possessed. The wedding was held at the Dawson Ranch in June, when the valley was at its summer peak, and Violet organized the celebration with the same comprehensive attention she brought to everything, and cried at the ceremony with a warmth and joy that she had always privately thought she would find difficult to locate when the moment came, and that came easily and fully, and without any of the complexity she had feared. Clara went to Denver in 1902, at 19, to attend the women's college that Abraham's patient correspondence had arranged her admission to, and left on the train on an October morning with her trunk and her mathematics textbooks, and the particular set of her jaw that indicated she had decided on something, and the universe would need to accommodate itself accordingly. Violet stood on the platform until the train was out of sight, and then turned to find Abraham beside her, and he put his arm around her, and she let herself be held in that way for a moment before straightening up and going to deal with what was next. Thomas, at 12, inherited the position of only child at home with the philosophical ease of someone who had been expecting it and had plans. His social gifts, as he grew older, were revealing themselves to be accompanied by a genuinely sharp intelligence that expressed itself differently from Clara's mathematical precision, but was no less real. And by the time he was 14, he was helping Abraham with the financial planning of the ranch, with a facility that made his father look at him with the particular quiet pride that careful men show when they are deeply moved. In the winter of 1903, Abraham was thrown from a horse, which was an event that seemed to belong to a different kind of story than the one they were living, but which happened nonetheless, because the world is indifferent to narrative tidiness. The injury was to his left shoulder, not catastrophic but significant, requiring a recovery of 6 weeks during which he could not ride and could not do the heavy work of the ranch, and which required him to accept help with a grace that did not come naturally to him, but which he managed because Violet was there, and because he had learned, over 25 years, that refusing help from the people who loved him was not strength, but a different kind of avoidance. She managed the ranch during those 6 weeks with the assistance of Samuel Trout and James and Thomas, and she came home each evening to where Abraham was convalescing with the reports and the decisions and the problems, and they worked through them together at the kitchen table the way they had worked through everything, and the shoulder healed, and he was back on horseback by February, and the season continued. By 1905, the Dawson Ranch was a different scale from what it had been in 1878, larger and more complex, with the horse breeding operation that James ran as a full partner alongside the cattle operation, and with the irrigation infrastructure that had transformed the northern pasture, and with the reputation in the county that accumulates around places that are consistently well managed and honestly operated. Abraham was 57 and Violet was 51, and they were both gray-haired and both entirely themselves, and the particular thing they had built together, the daily intimacy of a long and genuine marriage, was the most complete thing that either of them had ever made. Clara came home from Denver in 1906 with a degree and a position offered at a college in Colorado Springs that she intended to take, and she came home first for a summer that was one of the best summers Violet could remember. All 3 children home at once, James and Rosalie with their 2-year-old son, Violet and Abraham's first grandchild, a boy named Daniel who had James's dark hair and Rosalie's dark eyes and a personality still in formation, and Clara with her degree and her plans and her characteristic focused intensity, and Thomas, at 17, occupying the specific brilliant awkwardness of that age with more grace than most. There was an evening toward the end of that summer when all of them were on the porch after supper, in the long light of a Colorado August evening, and the valley was doing something extraordinary, the way it sometimes did, with the quality of the air and the way the mountains caught the last of the sun and held it, and Violet sat beside Abraham in the chairs they had placed there, and they watched their family arranged in the familiar beloved shapes of themselves. James talking to Rosalie with little Daniel asleep across his knees, Clara arguing cheerfully with Thomas about something mathematical that Thomas was following more easily than he should have been able to, the sounds of it all, familiar and specific and entirely irreplaceable. Abraham took her hand in the way he had taken it 100 times, 1,000 times in the years since the harvest supper of 1877, with the same warmth and the same deliberate care. "I tried to stop thinking about you," he said, quietly, so only she could hear, in the tone of someone completing a story they have been telling for 30 years. She looked at him, at the gray-haired, weathered, absolutely familiar and absolutely extraordinary face of the man who had stood in her doorway on an October morning with his hat in his hands and stripped every defense down to the truth. "I failed every single morning," he said, and smiled. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the evening closed around them, warm and full and without any shadow she could identify, and the mountains held the last of the light a little longer than seemed strictly necessary, and the valley breathed around them, and the family talked and laughed and the baby slept, and this, she thought, this exact accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary things was what she had come west to find. Not the advertisement, not the schoolhouse, not the landscape, though she loved it. This, the life that had been waiting, improbably and impossibly, in the form of a quiet man with dark, layered eyes who reached down a bolt of blue calico from a high shelf and said his name like it was the least complicated thing in the world, and who had spent the years since then proving, morning by morning, choice by choice, that the decision to remain and to risk and to love was the truest and the most consequential decision a person could make. She was glad, she thought, pressing her cheek against the familiar warmth of his shoulder while their grandchild slept and their children argued about mathematics in the August evening. She had always been glad,